Welcome to part two of Santa Barbara's fires, earthquakes, shipwrecks, and other disasters as seen through vintage postcards and photographs. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. As Harold Chase, realtor and brother of Pearl Chase, described our area, he said, "It was sun-kissed, ocean-washed, mountain-girded, and island-guarded." And I add, we love the setting, the architecture, the climate, the small town aspects with the big city attributes. Yes, Santa Barbara has many alluring qualities, and we are surely blessed. But as we saw in part one, life here is not always perfect. Shipwrecks in the channel and the ever-presence of natural disasters such as droughts, floods, fires, and earthquakes, and the human response thereof gives testimony to the spirit, strength, and resilience of its citizens in dealing with these calamities. In part one, we looked at the Chumash Tomol, the 1812 7.1 magnitude earthquake and the resultant tsunami, the terrifying fire of 1831, the New England trading ship Pilgrim, made famous by Charles Dana's classic book 2 Years Before the Mast, the shipwrecks of the Winfield Scott and the Yankee Blade, and the unusual actions of her captain, the reoccurring pattern of droughts followed by torrential rains, and concluded with the simoon of 1859 and its record-breaking heat. This timeline outlines what we will be looking at in this presentation, starting with the Rancheros era and concluding part two with the Honda train wreck, Santa Barbara's worst disaster. During the 1830s and 1840s, Santa Barbara, known as one of the cow counties, was engaged in the hide and tallow trade, the backbone of the early California ranchero economy. The 1850s, as a result of the gold rush, brought an unprecedented demand and need for large quantities of beef. The cattle, which had been slaughtered for their hides and tallow, now brought their owners great fortunes and monthly sales in the thousands of dollars. There were vast herds in Santa Barbara County. Guadalupe alone supported 40,000 head, and the De La Guerras had still more. The simple living of the Californians was now being turned upside down with the sudden wealth that had come to them. They were dazed by the prosperity and had more money than they knew what to do with. They spent the money as quickly as they earned it. Mirth and vanity reigned. Ladies refused to wear anything but silk stockings. Fine clothing was worn regardless of the time, place, or occasion. It was a day-long party as both señoritas and caballeros pranced about like bright birds. There was food for all, and no thought of want entered their minds. Among the popular pastimes of the Californians were horse races, bullfights, and bull and bear fights, where spectators would bet on which animal would survive. In this painting, vaqueros are capturing a California grizzly bear for one such event. Juan Bautista Alvarado, the longest tenured governor of Alta California, described one contest. The bull began the fight by charging the grizzly with his horns. A blow from the grizzly's paw did not stop the onset. In a moment, they were rolling over each other in the dust. But the bear finally, though badly gored, got his teeth fastened into the bull's neck, and the bull was pulled down to his knees. The bull's tongue hung out. This was what the bear wanted. He got his claw into the bull's mouth, pulled the tongue out still further, and then bit it off. With this, the bull gave up the contest, and soon after, both animals were dispatched. The rancheros' booming economy began to change, with competition from some enterprising people who began driving big herds purchased in the prairie states for $10 a head and reselling them in California for $100 a head. In 1861, unprecedented rains came to California. Sacramento, as seen in these two photographs, was flooded with 15 feet of water, and a steamboat navigated through the streets of the city. In Santa Barbara County, the constant torrential rains caused havoc. The Santa Maria Valley became a vast lake. Slides eroded, altered, and reshaped the landscape. The Goleta Estuary, once providing a safe haven for small ships, was filled with debris from the 5 creeks feeding it. Gravel, sand, silt, and uprooted trees filled the area to an estimated depth of 6 feet, dashing any hope of ever using it as a harbor again. The rains continued for weeks. 7 inches fell during one 40-hour period, putting Santa Barbara's Lower East Side completely underwater. Virtually all of the remaining structures of the Presidio were destroyed. Reports from other parts of the state were astonishing. San Francisco recorded 87 inches and Sonora 102 inches, or 8.5 feet of rain, all occurring over a 60-day period from December 1861 to January 1862. Paraphrasing Wikipedia, the Great Flood of 1862 was the largest flood in the recorded history of California. All the streams and rivers rose to great heights, flooded the valleys, or swept away towns, mills, dams, houses, fences, and ruined fields. 200,000 cattle drowned. The entire Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys were inundated for an area covering 300 miles and averaging 20 miles wide. It was estimated that approximately 1/4 of the taxable real estate in the state of California was destroyed in the flood. The state of California went bankrupt. The governor, state legislator, and state employees were not paid for a year and a half. I guess it wasn't all that bad, huh? Santa Barbara rancheros fared better than those whose herds had been devastated by the floods. 1862 was their last good year. The heavy rains were followed 2 years later by the Great Drought of 1863 to 1864. Only 4 inches of rain fell during the season, and in the fall, just a few showers, barely enough to start a blade of grass. Cattle were dying by the tens of thousands. Grizzlies, wolves, and buzzards feasted. Bones were everywhere. Before the year was over, the cattle kings were bankrupt all over California. The Santa Barbara County assessment that previous year showed over 200,000 cattle, which was most likely understated by 100,000. By the time the rains came in the winter of 1864, only 5,000 cattle had survived. Rancheros would hold matanzas or slaughters to keep their cattle from starvation. The skins and the tongues were taken and the carcasses left where they fell. The skins were dried and sold or stored, and the tongues were dried and consumed. One rancher declared his family lived on tongue, beans, and barley bread. Conditions were so bad that a San Francisco newspaper declared that people as well as cattle were starving in Santa Barbara, and a relief fund of $3,000 was sent. The Barbarinos politely declined the charity. They still had enough to eat, although their diet was getting monotonous. This stoic pride, typical of the Spanish Californians, never deserted them. They stood in the midst of ruin and saw the old free life being swept away from under them, along with the pastoral grandeur, comfort, respectability, and influence which they once had so bountifully enjoyed. What overproduction started, Mother Nature finished. The ranchero and cattle king reign had come to a close. Cattle, as the foundation of Santa Barbara's economy, was over. In the 1860s and 1870s, with the influx of many Americans, Santa Barbara was transformed from a Spanish town to an American one. The Spanish language, once the only language of the town, was now spoken by only half of the 2,500 inhabitants. With the demise of the rancheros or cattle kings, the sheep kings were substituted. The land grants had given way to the land barons and the financiers. The Hollister, Cooper, Dibley, Cook, and Eddy families were instrumental in this transformation, as their impact has been noted in previous presentations. The year 1875 brought abundant rain, but that year the bubble burst and the economy tanked. During the drought years of 1876 through 78, the sheep kings suffered heavily, losing half of their stock, and land prices plummeted. Then, coupled with the economic crisis, the ensuing drought of 1876-77 caused widespread unemployment and hardship in the city. Santa Barbara Mayor Richards reported, as a result of the depression of business throughout the county and the drought, the salaries of municipal employees are being cut and all street work suspended. Boy, it'd be real easy to get to like this guy, huh? Well, let's go back a few years with the mayor. Mayor Richards and the Santa Barbara Daily Press editor had taken sides on a Santa Barbara Railroad issue. With Richards' position prevailing, Johnson, in an editorial, stated, "Richards is an ass, stupid as he is brazen, with no more regard for his own word." End quote. The next day, they met on State Street, and the two men got into a fistfight. Richards soundly beat Johnson. Many of the onlookers cheered, having themselves been pierced by Johnson's poison pen. Richards became a local hero and was promptly elected mayor of Santa Barbara. Then the rains came. In January 1878, a heavy storm with high winds broke up the Chapala Street Wharf and destroyed most of Stearns Wharf. In February, a terrific rainstorm at Santa Cruz Island raised the creek 10 feet and washed away the old Indian burial grounds. Drought, rain, drought, rain. Is anyone sensing a trend here? On December 31st, 1878, Santa Barbara's first reported cyclone struck the city. The Santa Barbara Press called the southeaster the severest storm that Santa Barbara has ever experienced, and quoting the Santa Barbara Weekly Independent after the event, "The twister originated near Stearns Wharf and through an anchored vessel up against the wharf and into the shore toward the warehouses at the foot of the pier. A Chinese junk near the origin of the spout was swamped and sunk before the gigantic waterspout came ashore. it dropped a torrent of water from its vortex going up Delavina Street, its roaring whistle striking terror in the hearts of Santa Barbarans. The snake-like twister uprooted sycamore and oak trees, pulled a barn from its foundation that slid up Delavina for blocks until it finally disintegrated. A horse that had been in the barn was reportedly carried through the air for at least a block and then set gently down. Surprisingly, only one death resulted from this storm. There had been few structure fires in the early days since they were built with adobe and tile. With the coming of the Americans, the houses were built with more combustible materials. In 1871, fire consumed the American Hotel and a neighboring building. 3 years later, Pioneer Fire Company No. 1 was originated as a volunteer citizen firefighting group. After the newly completed St. Vincent Orphanage burned to the ground, a hand pumper and hose carriage were purchased. Then, the George Washington Fire Company was established and later absorbed Company No. 1. Firefighters pulled the pumper themselves until 1888, when the city acquired a team of horses to pull the steam pumper. By the 1880s, Santa Barbara's firefighting equipment included a steam pumper, a horse team, a hose cart with 800 feet of hose, a hook and ladder company, plus a system of cisterns and wells used as a water source for firefighting. The George Washington Fire Company became the Santa Barbara City Fire Department in 1906. In 1876, an attempt to burn down the city by a crazed man failed. 1890 saw Hollister's Glen Annie burned to the ground, and the next year, 1891, hooligans set fire to pampas grass decorating an arch erected for President Harrison's visit. This resulted in the ban of the use of plumes for decoration in the city. The next year, 1892, a fire on State Street almost consumed the entire 600 block, with 14 structures destroyed before it was brought under control. A decade later, in 1903, the Trinity Episcopal Church, located where the public library now stands, burned to the ground. The Arlington Hotel's main building was lost in 1909, followed by the total destruction of the bathhouse at Plaza Del Mar in 1913. In Los Alamos, the earth began to rumble on Sunday night, July 27, 1902. A strong shock awakened the residents at about 11 p.m. For the next 12 hours, 11 more earthquakes were felt. 4 days later, on the morning of the 31st at 1:20 a.m., the biggest earthquake struck. Some residents, thrown from their beds, left their homes in their night clothes and spent the rest of the night camped out in their yards. Chimneys and walls fell. Merchandise in stores and saloons was thrown to the floor. Trees were uprooted, and landslides were reported. Terror reigns in Los Alamos Valley, blasted the August 1, 1902 edition of the San Francisco Chronicle, reporting on a series of earthquakes that struck the small town. Quote, "With the first shock this morning, buildings in every part of the town tumbled down. It was preceded by a rumbling like that of a distant thunder, which increased until the earth began to rock and twist and the hills began to tremble. Los Alamos is now being deserted as fast as railroad and other means of transportation can be pressed into service. Churches have been leveled to the ground, frame buildings thrown from their foundations, telegraph and telephone wires have been broken. The village is almost entirely deserted." The Chronicle went on to report huge fissures 15 miles long and 4 miles wide, had been opened by the earthquakes. The earthquakes themselves were said to be the result of a nearby volcano." End quote. The reality of what happened in Los Alamos was much less sensational, as the Chronicle was forced to admit. Quote, "The reports of damage done have been swelled beyond all reason, and the stories of panic so distorted as to be almost absolute lies. Considerable feeling is manifest throughout the entire region against the author of the sensational reports sent out from Los Alamos." The paper did go on to say, those who had the time for such occupation claimed to have counted 75 separate shocks, and that an evacuation of about 60 people from the town did occur. Earthquakes continued to be felt 5 months later until December 13th. One of the more interesting effects of these earthquakes was the transformation of Los Alamos Creek from a dry creek bed to a flowing river 2 feet deep and 18 feet wide. Following the 1902 Los Alamos earthquakes, many so-called experts were proposing wild theories as to the cause of the tremblers, including the volcano scenario. It would not be until the 1960s that the theory of plate tectonics would emerge. "145 Shriners and their wives from lodges in Reading, Pennsylvania and Buffalo, New York, were in Los Angeles having attended a national convention. On May 10th, they enjoyed a leisure day of sightseeing in the city. Early the next day, they boarded a train, the Shriners Special, and by early afternoon the train, pulling 6 passenger cars, a luggage car, a diner, and 4 sleepers, pulled out of Santa Barbara, heading for what would be the worst disaster in the history of Santa Barbara County. The day was perfectly clear as the passengers were enjoying the scenery of barren and rugged coastline as the train approached Point Honda, 65 miles north of Santa Barbara. Conflicting newspaper reports of the tragedy have the train traveling at speeds anywhere between 35 and 60 miles an hour when the locomotive left the tracks, flipping the engine on its side. When the engine derailed, cars telescoped into the boiler, releasing steam and killing passengers trapped in the splintered cars. The train's conductor shinnied up a telegraph pole, tapping out the first news of the accident into San Luis Obispo, the closest city to the wreck. The 2 arrows on the map point to the approximate area where the wreck occurred. The area today is still as remote as it was back in 1907. Trains carrying doctors, nurses, medical, and other emergency supplies were dispatched from San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara. The train from the north reached the disaster scene within 2 hours, while the train from the south was delayed, awaiting an engineer. As the Santa Barbara Morning Press headline states, when help arrived, they found 27 dead. 5 more were to die soon thereafter. The scene was chaotic. Many of the injured were stunned and delirious. A cook was incoherent because he could not find the chickens he was going to prepare for dinner, and another man walked around asking people if his tie was straight. And from the San Luis Obispo Morning Tribune, mingled with these heart-rending cries came the noise of escaping steam from the engine, and its shower of death brought forth the greatest horrors of the awful catastrophe. People who would have had some chance to escape or later to have recovered from the injuries were so scalded that death soon resulted. Indeed, third-degree burns resulting from escaping steam appears to have been the greatest single killer and crippler in the disaster. A surviving passenger, John Calvin Hoffeditz, gave this account of the horrific event. He was in the diner at the time of the wreck. I had been seated at the table about 20 minutes when I felt a sudden lurch of the car, and the next thing I knew, I was wedged in with a mess of car timbers, and all about me the moans and sobs of the injured could be heard. Hoffeditz was among the lucky ones who were not scalded with steam from the engine's ruptured boiler. He survived with a fractured ankle, a 4-inch scalp wound, and numerous facial abrasions. From the Morning Press, Santa Barbara. Mrs. A.D. Wasson of Buffalo, who is suffering from painful injuries, apparently is unable yet to emerge from the daze which followed the realization of her losses in the wreck. Mrs. Wasson had just left her husband in the diner when the train struck the broken switch. He was crushed and literally cooked to death, leaving his wife a widow with a 3-year-old baby. This story and several that follow are from the Oakland Tribune of 13 May 1907. Hearing screams, we forced our way over the ruins. Mrs. Grumman of Binghamton was pinned down and screaming for aid. Mr. and Mrs. Cutler were lying on her, both dead. We talked with Mrs. Grumman and assured her that we would take her out. I never saw a braver nor pluckier little woman. For 2 hours we worked there, and her voice always cheered us on. The car leaned perilously, and we had to take crowbars and dig our way through trunks, pulling the clothing out to get the trunks loose, so fast they were wedged. All the time we feared fire, for the peril was great, but at last we reached the woman and took her out. Her ankle was broken. The relief train came, and we loaded the injured on it and sent them to San Luis Obispo. Many rescuers performed heroically, dealing with the injured, as did many of the passengers. C.M. Tyson, who collapsed after rescuing many bodies from the boiling water pouring out of the shattered kitchen range, is still ill, but will be able to travel homeward when his Buffalo friends leave tonight. And the wife of the flagman at Honda was cited for her efforts in bringing coffee and makeshift bandages fashioned from clothing to the injured in the wreckage. And this captioned, "Plunky woman rode brake beam to give her help at wreck." Refused a ride inside the relief train on its way to the Shriners wreck at Honda yesterday, Miss Marie Fuller of Los Angeles got there anyhow. Miss Fuller was going as far as San Francisco with the Shriners on the third section immediately behind the wrecked train, and when the Santa Barbara relief train arrived at Sutton, she asked if she could accompany the nurses and doctors. "No," said Dr. Taylor, and he forgot all about this bright-eyed girl of 19 until the conductor of the train called his attention to a wisp of brown hair floating in the wind above the platform of the front car. There, on the brake beam, which hardly afforded a foothold, crouched the daring young woman. Dr. Taylor was more frightened than she, from the train's speed of 50 miles an hour, did not seem to impress her as dangerous. "Don't you know you might have been killed?" "I might," replied Miss Fuller, "but I just had to go to the wreck. You wouldn't let me ride inside, so I got aboard outside. I am a member of the Southgate Lodge Eastern Star," she explained, "and I'm pledged to give aid wherever possible. It was possible to help those poor wreck victims in spite of the doctor." Several theories of the cause of the accident were put forward. The engineer, Charles Champlain, testified he heard a loud metallic crack the instant before the train derailed. A defective switch, a broken rail, a boulder on the track, a failed axle, and a split rail were all investigated. Grand juries were convened in both San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara to investigate the cause and came up empty-handed. Neither could agree on what may have caused the worst human disaster in the history of Santa Barbara County. Santa Barbara has its share of natural and man-made disasters, but the good far outweighs the bad. There is no place on earth that is immune from disasters, and no place on earth that my family would rather live.
Through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of a storm is a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams